The night my son threw my suitcase into the driveway, the rain poured so hard I couldn't tell if the water on my face was from the sky or my own tears. I stood there, clutching the handle of that old suitcase like it could keep me upright, staring at his house as the porch light flicked off and the deadbolt clicked shut. In that moment, something inside me shattered so quietly, no one even noticed. 2 years later, I stood in front of another door with the same steady hands and closed it on someone who thought they'd broken me. Stay with me till the very end and let me know where you're watching from so I can see how far the truth really spreads. My name is Evelyn Parker. I'm 72 years old, though some nights it feels closer to 100. I still remember the sound of the latch turning behind me, the sharp click of the deadbolt, and the sudden hush as the porch light went dark. My son didn't even bother to watch me leave. I stood in the driveway, my suitcase tipped over in the gravel rain, soaking through my thin sweater. The front door didn't budge. Not even when I knocked one last time, just to be sure he meant it. That night, the rain came down hard and steady, and I didn't know where to go. I stood there staring at that house like if I stood long enough, someone might open the door and take it all back. But the curtains stayed drawn. The lights in the living room went out one by one, and by the time the whole house had gone quiet, my suitcase was heavy in my hand and my feet were numb from standing too long. The street felt empty and cold, just like the look in my son's eyes when he told me to leave. It's strange how a moment like that can split your life in two, before and after. That driveway was the last place I stood as someone's mother who believed she still mattered. Everything after that was just survival. A week later, I would learn the kind of pain that doesn't even let you cry anymore. That's when Lily, the one person I trusted left in this world, took the last bit of me I was clinging to. She smiled when she did it too. I can still feel that rain, sometimes even on a dry day. Cold and steady on my shoulders, making my hair stick to my face. I kept my head down because even though no one was watching, I couldn't let myself fall apart yet. Not there in that driveway where he could still see me from the upstairs window if he cared to look. Last week, though, I stood somewhere very different. I stood in front of a flower shop on Main Street, the one with the bright green awning and the glass door Lily had dreamed of her whole life. I held a different kind of key in my hand that day, and when I turned it in the lock, the sign I hung on the door read closed. I never said a word, just hung the sign, turned my back, and walked away. What hurts more, being betrayed by blood or by someone you thought was family? I still don't know the answer. But I know this. You only have to betray me once. I wasn't always standing in the rain with nowhere to go. There was a time when my life felt full, even if it wasn't easy. I married young and poured everything I had into making a home for my little family. My husband, Robert, worked hard, but his health failed him early. I spent most of my 30s and 40s by his side, running between hospital visits and late shifts just to keep us afloat. It never felt like a burden then. He was my partner, and my son was my reason to keep going. My son Daniel was my pride. He was such a bright boy. I'd sit in the stands at his high school games and feel like my heart would burst when they called his name. He went on to college, the first in our family, and every time he came home, I'd fill the table with his favorite foods just to see that smile. Even after his father passed, even when the house felt too quiet, I thought we'd made it through the worst. When Robert died, the bills came fast. Medical debt we'd never dreamed of, and a mortgage that kept climbing. Daniel was just starting his career trying to build a life with his new wife, and when he told me he needed help, I didn't even hesitate. I sold the house Robert and I had lived in for 35 years and gave Daniel everything he needed to clear his debts. He promised it was just a rough patch, that things would turn around soon, and of course I believed him. He asked me to come stay with them until I figured out what was next. I thought it was a blessing, to still feel needed. Those first months living in their home, I told myself I was lucky. They let me have the spare room, though it was small and crowded with boxes. I cooked their dinners, folded their laundry, kept myself busy. Some nights I'd sit alone and wonder if Robert would have been proud of how I held our family together. That thought kept me from feeling too sad when they stayed out late or forgot to invite me to dinners with friends. Lily was always there for me through those years. She and I had been inseparable since grade school, two girls who'd always had each other's backs. When Robert got sick, she'd come by with casseroles and sit with me for hours, listening to me cry when no one else would. She never judged, never made me feel small. After I moved in with Daniel, and his wife Lily would call me every week just to check in. Sometimes she'd pick me up, and we'd sit in her car with coffee cups in hand, watching people walk by downtown. Those were the moments I could almost forget how different my life felt now. She used to talk about her dream of opening a little flower shop. She'd tell me what she'd name it, where she'd put the vases, how she'd finally feel proud of something of her own. She said if she ever got the chance, she'd make it come true, and I believed her. Lily had a way of making her dreams sound like promises. Looking back now, I think I clung to those talks with Lily because they reminded me of myself before the years wore me down. I thought of her as family, someone who would always be there like she always had been. At the time, I trusted her more than anyone else in the world. I didn't know then how fragile trust can be when you put it in the wrong hands. At first, I tried to ignore the way her voice tightened whenever I entered the room. Daniel's wife Claire would look at me like I was a stain she couldn't scrub out her polite smile, barely hiding the resentment underneath. I kept telling myself it was just stress, that maybe she just needed time to adjust, but the words she let slip told me otherwise. She started calling the room I slept in the storage room, even though it had been cleared out for me when I moved in. There were still boxes stacked along the walls, and I had barely enough space to slide my suitcase under the cot they'd given me. She'd remind me every morning not to touch anything that didn't belong to me, like I was some stranger they were forced to take in. The comments got sharper as the weeks passed. One night, as she set the table, she muttered under her breath that maybe if I had my own money, I wouldn't be here like a leash. My hands froze where I stood, holding a plate, but I didn't look up. I couldn't. That word stayed with me, clinging to me like a brand. Leech. She never said those things in front of Daniel. At least, not at first. When he came home late, she'd greet him sweetly, and I'd retreat to my little cot and pretend not to hear them laughing in the kitchen. But when he wasn't around, her tone was cold and her patience wore thin. She'd sigh loudly when I moved too slowly, or tell me to keep my things out of the way, as if I was taking up too much space. Every day I folded their laundry and cooked their meals, thinking it might soften her heart. I told myself to be grateful to endure. But with every remark, every long glance of disgust, it felt less like a home and more like a sentence I was serving. I started to feel smaller in that room, like I was disappearing into the boxes around me, one hurtful word at a time. It happened on a Wednesday night, halfway through dinner. The clatter of forks and knives filled the silence until Claire set hers down with a loud scrape and stared straight at me. Her voice was sharp and clear as she said I needed to find somewhere else to go, that this arrangement wasn't working anymore, and she was done pretending it was. I waited for Daniel to say something, anything, but he never lifted his eyes from his plate. He just kept eating while the words hung in the air between us, heavy and final. My chest ached as I looked at him, hoping to see even a flicker of hesitation, but there was none. I nodded and pushed my chair back slowly, careful not to make a sound. No one spoke. No one stopped me. I walked down the hallway to my room and closed the door behind me, resting my back against it for just a second before I reached for my suitcase. It didn't take long to pack. There wasn't much to take. A few changes of clothes, a framed photo of Robert and me, and the small stack of letters Lily had sent me over the years. I zipped the suitcase shut and sat on the edge of the cot for one last moment, staring at the boxes that lined the walls, feeling like they had swallowed me whole. When I walked back through the kitchen, Daniel and Claire were still at the table finishing their dinner. Neither of them looked up as I passed. My shoes made soft, hollow sounds against the tile, each step louder in my own ears than it should have been. I opened the front door and stepped out into the night, pulling the suitcase behind me. The air was cool and still, and the porch light flickered before going dark as the door clicked shut behind me. Not a single word of goodbye. Not a single glance. Just silence as I walked away. I didn't have anywhere else to go, so I called Lily. Her voice on the other end was soft and familiar, like nothing had changed since we were two girls walking home from school together. When I showed up at her door, she opened it wide, wrapped her arms around me, and told me she'd never let me feel alone, not as long as she was here. She made me a cup of tea and let me cry at her kitchen table, patting my hand and telling me that family didn't always mean blood. She said I was like a sister to her, had always been, and I believed her because I needed to. She helped me bring my suitcase inside and told me I could stay as long as I needed. A few days later, she sat across from me and gently asked what I planned to do next. I told her I wasn't sure, that everything I'd had was gone, and her eyes softened, like she understood. I handed her the envelope with my last bit of savings and all the paperwork I'd managed to grab from Daniel's house. She promised she'd keep it safe, said she'd hold on to it for me until I got back on my feet. For the first time in weeks, I let myself believe I might be okay. She talked about her flower shop dream again while we sat on the porch at night, her voice full of quiet excitement. She said she'd been saving for years but never quite had enough, and I told her I'd always believed she'd make it happen someday. When she smiled at me and said maybe it would happen sooner than she thought, I smiled back. I spent the next month trying to piece myself back together. I took long walks in the park and let the sun warm my face. I even started looking for little jobs, thinking it was time to start over. Then one afternoon, I passed a bulletin board downtown and saw the flyer, Grand Opening of Lily's Bloom. The name caught my breath because it was the same one she'd always talked about, the one she said she'd use if she ever opened her shop. The flyer showed a picture of her smiling in front of a storefront draped with flowers and bright green awnings. I stared at it so long that someone walking by had to excuse themselves to reach past me. I went home and sat in her driveway for an hour before I got out of the car. When I finally walked into the shop, the bell above the door chimed, and Lily looked up from behind the counter. For just a second, she froze, then her face went cold. She walked over and told me I couldn't be here. She said everything in this place was hers now that I'd given it to her. I stood there in the middle of all those fresh flowers, their sweet smell clinging to the air, and I couldn't move. She said I needed to leave, that this wasn't my place anymore. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but nothing came out. My hands trembled at my sides as she turned her back to me and started arranging a bouquet like I wasn't even there. The bell above the door rang again when I finally walked out. Outside, the sun was shining bright and warm, but it didn't touch me. I kept my head down, clutching the strap of my purse like it was the only thing keeping me upright. I didn't even make it to the car before the tears came hot and silent. In that moment, I wasn't sure which hurt worse, losing my family or losing her. I didn't go back to Lily's shop, and I didn't call her. I didn't stand on her porch demanding answers or cry on her sidewalk. I kept quiet because I knew nothing I said would change what she'd already decided to do. I left town that same week and found a small room in an old boarding house 2 towns over. The paint peeled in the corners and the window stuck when I tried to open it, but it was mine and no one could tell me to leave. I paid in cash each week and kept to myself, blending in with the other women who carried grocery bags up the narrow stairs and kept their eyes down. During the day, I took whatever work I could find. I cleaned motel rooms for a while, then worked behind the counter of a gas station. Some evenings I ironed shirts for a dry cleaner, and every dollar I made went into an envelope I kept tucked inside my pillowcase. At night, I sat at the little desk in my room with a cup of tea and a stack of books from the library. I started reading about property law contracts and fraud. The language was thick and hard to follow at first, but I kept at it, underlining sentences and writing notes in the margins. After a few weeks, I began to understand how much I hadn't understood before. How easy it had been for Lily to take what was mine while I signed papers I never really read. When I felt ready, I made an appointment with a lawyer in town. She was young but sharp, and when I told her my story, she listened carefully, her eyes narrowing, as she flipped through the copies of the documents I'd brought. She explained exactly where Lily had crossed the line, how she'd slipped clauses into the forms that gave her ownership over accounts and assets I never intended to give away. The lawyer said it wouldn't be easy, but it was possible to take it all back if I was willing to be patient. So I was patient. I worked my shifts, paid my rent, and met with the lawyer every month to sign forms and file motions. Each step felt like climbing a hill in the dark, but I never stopped. Some nights, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about how Lily must have smiled as she signed my name, how she'd stood in her shop and pretended to have earned something she stole. And every time I thought of that, my resolve grew stronger. Nearly a year later, the papers were in order. My lawyer called me in and handed me a thin folder with all the signatures I needed. It didn't look like much, just black ink on white paper, but it meant everything. It meant justice. The building where Lily's flower shop stood was owned by an old developer who was happy to sell it off as long as the price was right. I didn't buy it under my own name. I formed a small company and used it to close the deal quietly. No one questioned it. No one knew. I stood on the sidewalk across from the shop the day the sale was final, watching through the window as Lily rearranged roses in a vase. She looked happy, confident. She had no idea the ground beneath her had already shifted. I stayed there a long time, hands in my pockets, until the sun sank low behind the buildings. I didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. What I felt was steady. Like finally, after all these years, I was standing on solid ground again. I didn't need to shout or scream or make a scene. I just needed to keep moving one quiet step at a time toward what was mine. The morning of Lily's grand opening was warm and bright. A breeze carried the scent of flowers down the street, and the sidewalk outside her shop was crowded with guests dressed in their Sunday best. Balloons swayed on the awning, and soft music drifted through the open door as people lined up to congratulate her. I stood just across the street watching. My hair was swept up neatly, my dress pressed and my shoes polished until they gleamed. When the last of the guests stepped inside, I crossed over slowly. Every step was deliberate, quiet, but heavy with everything she'd taken from me. A few heads turned as I walked in, but no one said anything. I carried a folded notice in my hand, crisp and official, and I didn't bother to smile when I reached the counter. Lily looked up, her face lighting up for just a second before she realized it was me. Then her smile faltered, and her eyes darkened as she set down the bouquet she'd been arranging. Without a word, I reached over and taped the notice to the door where everyone could see it. Business suspended, pending owner review. The chatter in the shop quieted to a hush, and Lily's cheeks flushed as she stared at the words. Her voice was low and trembling when she finally asked what I was doing. I looked her in the eye, calm and steady, and told her she buried my trust and now I was burying her dream. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I turned and walked out into the sun, leaving the door swinging shut behind me as the silence inside grew heavier. I never went back to see what she did next. I didn't need to. The notice stayed up the shop, stayed dark, and I went on with my life. I moved into a small house on the edge of a quiet neighborhood where the streets were lined with trees that bloomed pink in the spring. My garden out back was nothing fancy, just rows of daisies, marigolds, and wild roses, but it was mine. Letters started arriving from Lily not long after. Some angry, some pleading. I tore them in half and dropped them in the trash without reading past the first line. The phone rang one evening, and I recognized my son's voice on the other end, soft and full of regret. He tried to tell me he was sorry, that he'd made a mistake, but I just let the silence stretch until he finally hung up. There were no more suitcases on driveways, no more locked doors or cramped storage rooms. Just quiet mornings in my own kitchen with the scent of fresh coffee and the sun streaming through the window. I'd go outside and kneel in the dirt, my hands deep in the soil planting seeds and pulling weeds until the beds looked just the way I liked them. Every time I clipped a perfect white bloom from one of my rose bushes, I felt a calm settle over me. Justice didn't have to roar. Sometimes it just needed to be steady, quiet, and sure. And for the first time in years, I finally felt like myself again. Sometimes the people you love the most teach you how strong you really are. You don't see it at first. You just feel the hurt, the sharp edges of what they took from you, and you think you'll never be whole again. But one day, you wake up and realize you kept going even when you thought you couldn't. You realize you're still standing. Sometimes those same people also teach you how to walk away. They show you what it feels like to be betrayed so deeply you finally have no choice but to let go. That's the hardest part. Not the pain, not the loneliness. The letting go. But once you do, it feels like air filling your lungs for the first time in years. I thought my life was over the night my son closed the door on me. I thought I was finished when Lily turned her back. But I wasn't. I was just beginning to understand who I really was. Quiet doesn't mean weak. Kind doesn't mean blind. Now, when I wake up in my own house with my hands in my own garden, I feel nothing but peace. My flowers bloom because I care for them. My home is mine because I fought for it. And my heart is whole because I finally chose myself. I look back now and I don't hate them. I don't even wish them harm. I just hope someday they understand what they lost when they let me go. The sun is warm on my shoulders as I stand at the kitchen counter, trimming white roses and arranging them in a glass vase. The petals are soft against my fingers, and the light pours in through the window golden and gentle. It feels quiet here, but it's a good kind of quiet. The kind you earn, the kind you deserve. And for the first time in my life, I finally know that strength was mine all along. I just needed them to show me where to find it.